Have you ever wondered what happens when a man at the pinnacle of power crushes someone he deems invisible? He thought my silence was submission. He did not realize that some people do not scream when pushed into a corner. Instead, they quietly change the digital locks to the entire building. Beware of the people you call nobodies, because when we finally decide to leave, we might just take the very air you breathe with us. Hello, dear listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for your continued support and for tuning in today with such incredible loyalty. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to operate, which means we are forced to stop uploading new videos here for the foreseeable future and will be transitioning our operations entirely over to Patreon. If you find today's story compelling, please support us by joining our Patreon channel to hear even better, much longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, featuring multiple emotional voice actors, bringing the characters to life in a single narrative. You can join our community right now by scanning the QR code of our Patreon page currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story and step into the world of a brilliant woman named Avery Ward. I am 34 years old, and for the last 5 years, my entire life had been confined to the sterile, hyper-modern walls of Aegis Core Health Logistics. I sat in the furthest, most shadowed corner of the grand boardroom on the 40th floor of our Seattle headquarters. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the churning waters of Puget Sound looked the exact color of bruised iron under a heavy, relentlessly gray sky. The oppressive weather outside perfectly matched the atmosphere inside. The room was a monument to corporate excess, filled with polished mahogany, plush custom leather chairs, and the faint, expensive scent of designer cologne. It was a fragrant, intoxicating veil meant to mask the absolute moral decay of the executives breathing that very air. This afternoon meeting was supposed to be a standard operational review. Instead, it had rapidly morphed into a slaughter of fundamental ethics. The core agenda was a massive, aggressive cost-cutting initiative targeting the transportation of specialty pharmaceuticals. We were talking about life-saving medications, complex biologics, and advanced cancer treatments that required strict, unbroken cold-chain logistics. A fluctuation of even 2 degrees could render these drugs entirely useless, or worse, actively toxic to the vulnerable patients relying on them. I was the lead systems engineer for the logistics grid, and I was the only person sitting at that incredibly long, glossy table who was outright refusing to sign the approval documents. The new routing and power protocols they desperately wanted to implement severely violated the mandatory temperature safety standards enforced by the Food and Drug Administration. They wanted to throttle the refrigeration units on our ocean freighters to save millions of dollars in fuel costs, literally gambling with human lives to pad their quarterly profit margins. CEO Richard Vance paced at the head of the table like a predator in a bespoke suit. He was a man composed entirely of arrogance and inherited privilege, the kind of executive who viewed human suffering as mere decimals on a financial spreadsheet. He hated resistance, and he especially hated being told no by someone he considered beneath his notice. When he finally realized I was not going to bend to his will and sign the paper, he decided to use me as a sacrificial lamb. He needed a public execution to keep the rest of the board in line. He marched over to where I was sitting, snatched my printed, 80-page risk assessment file from the table, and threw it violently onto the hardwood floor. The heavy, humiliating thud echoed sharply against the acoustic glass walls. He leaned heavily on the table, invading my personal space, and pointed a meticulously manicured finger directly at my face. "You are nothing but a nobody obsessed with boring numbers," Richard sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt and toxic authority. "You lack the vision to see the big corporate picture. I am done dealing with your bureaucratic paranoia. You are off this project. Effective immediately. Get out of my sight and pack your desk." The silence that followed his outburst lasted only a fleeting heartbeat before the laughter started. It rippled through the boardroom like a poisonous gas. The entire room chuckled. Colleagues who had stood at my small cubicle just a week ago practically begging me to fix their coding errors and cover up their logistical mistakes, now deliberately turned their faces away from me. The laughter they offered to Richard was sharp, completely sycophantic, and incredibly fake. They were laughing to appease the man who signed their massive bonus checks. It was a cold, metallic sound, entirely devoid of any genuine amusement, vibrating with the cowardice of people terrified for their own comfortable jobs. They fully expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, to beg for my position, to flush brilliant red with humiliation, or to scream about justice and patient safety. I did absolutely none of those things. I kept my breathing even, taking a slow, deep drag of the perfectly climate-controlled air. I calmly bent down, completely ignoring the scattered files of my warnings littered across the floor, and picked up only my favorite silver pen. I sat back up, closed my laptop with a soft, definitive click, and stood to my feet. I did not utter a single word of protest. As I walked across the vast expanse of the boardroom toward the heavy oak doors, I felt the corners of my mouth lift into a slight, genuine smile. A strange, weightless relief washed over my shoulders. I caught the eye of the Vice President of Operations as I passed his chair. The smug, mocking look on his face instantly faltered, replaced by a sudden, involuntary shudder. The sheer tranquility of my exit made a few people in that room feel a sudden, icy chill crawling up their spines. They did not understand that my silence was not a surrender. I stepped out of the boardroom and into the glass elevator at the end of the hall. As the carriage began its rapid stomach-dropping descent down to the ground floor, leaving the 40th floor far behind in the clouds, I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket. With a few swift taps, I accessed the company's secure back-end portal. First, I permanently unlinked my physical employee badge from the central security network. Then, my thumb hovered over the most critical interface of all. I accessed the core registry and disabled my personal identification code. It was a hidden fail-safe protocol I had woven into the architecture 3 years ago. What Richard Vance and his room full of laughing sycophants did not know was that my specific string of digits was the digital anchor keeping the entire global transport network legally compliant. Without my code actively authenticating the temperature logs, the system would automatically flag every single vessel as compromised. I was not just leaving the building, I was quietly removing the foundational pillar holding up their billion-dollar empire. My small apartment on the outskirts of the city felt like a sanctuary, a quiet universe entirely separated from the corporate hurricane I had just walked away from. The space was modest, filled with warm amber lighting and tall wooden bookshelves that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, freezing glass walls of the Aegis Corps headquarters. I walked into the tiny kitchen and put the kettle on the stove. Listening to the gentle, rising hiss of the boiling water, I carefully steeped a cup of chamomile tea, letting the soothing, earthy floral scent fill the room. Taking the warm ceramic mug in my hands, I walked over to the bay window and sat down on the cushioned window seat. Outside, the relentless Seattle rain drummed a hypnotic, steady rhythm against the glass pane. I watched the water trace wandering paths down the window, perfectly at peace. I did not feel an ounce of panic. I did not feel the crushing weight of unemployment or the sting of public humiliation. I was completely detached, floating in a profound stillness, waiting for the inevitable dominoes to begin their descent. The absolute silence of my apartment held steady for several hours. Then, exactly at 9 o'clock at night, the black screen of my cell phone resting on the wooden coffee table suddenly flared to life. A harsh, synchronized vibration rattled against the wood. It was not a phone call. It was a rapid succession of automated encrypted text messages rolling in from the central servers. The IT department was awake, and they were panicking. Through the secure monitor logs mirroring on my device, I could see exactly what they were doing in real time. Richard Vance had ordered his team of network administrators to manually override the safety protocols. They were aggressively trying to forcefully bypass the temperature validation layer so they could activate the cheap, unauthorized ocean transport routes for the pharmaceutical shipments. I watched the server traffic spike and crash as they threw brute force commands against the firewall. They were treating my system like a simple padlock they could break with a digital sledgehammer. They failed to realize that the architecture I built was not a door to be kicked down. It was a living, highly sensitive ecosystem designed to react to trauma. About 45 minutes later, after his tech team undoubtedly failed to breach the core mainframe, my phone chimed with a different notification tone. It was a direct text message from Richard Vance himself. Even through a glowing screen, his overwhelming arrogance bled into the room. "Send the handover password immediately," the message read. "Do not make things complicated for yourself. You have no way to win this." I took a slow sip of my chamomile tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. Most people in my position would have felt an uncontrollable surge of righteous anger. They would have typed out a furious paragraph defending their honor, or perhaps ignored the message entirely out of sheer spite. I did neither. Anger is a messy, unpredictable emotion that leads to mistakes, and I had spent too long designing this precise moment to let emotion ruin it. I calmly opened the secure encrypted vault application hidden deep within my phone interface. I highlighted a very specific sequence of 16 alphanumeric characters, copied it to my clipboard, and pasted it into the reply box of the text thread. I did not add a single word of explanation. I did not include a threat or a warning. I just hit send, offering him the exact string of text he demanded. Sitting in his lavish penthouse, Richard undoubtedly saw that sequence of 16 characters and smiled a victorious, predatory smile. He must have felt a supreme sense of triumph, thoroughly convinced that his aggressive intimidation tactics had successfully crushed the insignificant engineer. I could perfectly picture him eagerly handing his phone over to his lead developer, ordering the man to input those 16 characters directly into the master administrative terminal to unlock the shipping grids. They typed it in, they pressed enter, and in doing so, they triggered a spectacular silent catastrophe. That sequence of characters was not a master password. It was not a key designed to open the administrative gates. It was a highly classified command line known as the absence confirmation command. By actively inputting that specific string of code from a terminal that was not my own, the system instantly cross-referenced the entry with the fact that my physical employee badge had been deactivated hours ago. The mainframe logic immediately concluded that the sole mandatory safety supervisor had been forcibly removed from her post, and that an unauthorized, hostile entity was currently attempting to seize control of the fragile pharmaceutical logistics grid. The screen of my cell phone suddenly shifted from the standard blue interface to a deep, flashing crimson red. A single line of bold white text materialized across the center of the display. Shadow protocol activated. I set my empty teacup down on the windowsill and leaned back against the cushions. Richard Vance thought he was breaking into my system, but instead, he had just willingly turned the key on the inside of a heavy steel vault. He had manually locked the very trap I had meticulously built and buried deep within the source code 3 years ago. The game was no longer in my hands. The machine was now awake, and it was absolutely merciless. When the morning sun broke across the horizon, it illuminated a coordinated, global standstill of unprecedented proportions. Out in the vast, turbulent expanses of the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, 14 massive cargo vessels simultaneously lost their forward propulsion. The gigantic diesel engines, usually vibrating with tens of thousands of horsepower, ground to a heavy, echoing halt. The sudden silence on the open water was deafening. These were not ordinary container ships hauling electronics or clothing. They were floating fortresses carrying billions of dollars worth of highly volatile, temperature-sensitive medical supplies. The moment the engines died, the heavy steel containers did not just sit idly on the decks. The internal refrigeration systems completely severed their connection to the corporate satellite network. They physically shifted into a self-governing, autonomous survival mode. Heavy biometric locks slammed shut and engaged on every single container door, sealing the life-saving cargo tightly away from any human interference or remote tampering. Back in Seattle, the Aegis Core Control Center was rapidly descending into absolute madness. The sprawling wall of digital maps, usually a calming, orderly grid of green tracking lines tracing across the globe, had violently shifted to a blinding, flashing crimson. Warning sirens blared relentlessly through the operation floor, making it impossible to think. Technicians scrambled over their keyboards, shouting over one another in a state of pure, unadulterated panic. They hammered at their terminals, trying to force reboot commands, but the network completely rejected their credentials. On the main overhead display, a single, terrifying notification pulsed in bold white letters over the blood-red background. Level 1 standard violation, awaiting FDA verification. While the 40-story corporate tower was burning down in a metaphorical fire of its own making, I was quietly tying my shoes in my bedroom. My cell phone, resting on the kitchen marble counter, was practically having a seizure. It vibrated so violently it nearly danced off the edge. I walked into the kitchen and watched the caller identification screen flash rapidly. First, it was the Vice President of Operations. Then, 3 different members of the Executive Board. Then, the Central Switchboard. Routing emergency lines. Within a span of 20 minutes, I received over 4 dozen frantic calls. I did not silence the phone, nor did I answer it. I simply picked the device up, dropped it into my heavy coat pocket, and walked out my front door into the waking city. The morning air was exceptionally crisp and refreshing. I strolled leisurely down the busy sidewalk, taking in the sights of the neighborhood starting its day. Commuters rushed past me with their briefcases, entirely unaware of the invisible digital war raging across the ocean. I stepped into my favorite corner bakery, relishing the rich, warm scent of freshly roasted coffee beans and baked buttery pastries. I politely ordered a large, dark roast coffee and bought a freshly printed morning newspaper from the stand near the register. I found a small wrought iron table outside on the patio, sat down, and deliberately unfolded the paper, entirely unbothered by the fact that I had just paralyzed a global, multi-billion-dollar supply chain. I was halfway through an incredibly mundane article about local city council zoning regulations when my phone buzzed again. This time, the screen displayed a completely unknown local number. They were getting desperate enough to use burner phones. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, set the ceramic cup down on the table, and swiped my finger across the glass to accept the call. "Avery, please tell me you can fix this," a voice pleaded through the speaker. It was the Director of Information Technology. His voice was trembling so severely I could barely understand his frantic words. He sounded exactly like a man standing blindfolded on the edge of a cliff. "We are completely locked out of the mainframe. The administrative rights are gone. We cannot intervene with the ocean freighters at all. The ships have forcefully dropped anchor, and the onboard computers have gone totally rogue." I listened to his frantic, ragged breathing, saying absolutely nothing. The silence from my end only amplified his terror. "Avery, you do not understand the magnitude of this," the IT director stammered, his panic escalating into sheer hysteria. "The source code on the vessels did not just lock us out of the controls. It executed a massive, automated data dump. The system packaged all the hidden logs of the unauthorized route changes and the attempted temperature overrides that Richard ordered last night. It sent an anonymous, encrypted report straight to the federal regulatory agencies. The government has the data. The FDA is going to tear us apart." Before I could even process his confession, there was a loud, violent crash on the other end of the line, followed by the distinct sound of a physical scuffle. Someone had violently snatched the phone away from him. "You psychotic, ungrateful wretch!" Richard Vance roared into the receiver. His polished, arrogant corporate composure had entirely disintegrated, replaced by the rabid, spit-flying fury of a cornered animal. "I will absolutely destroy you for this. I will sue you into total bankruptcy. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life rotting in a federal prison cell. You are illegally holding billions of dollars of our company property hostage, you miserable thief." I held the phone slightly away from my ear, letting him exhaust his lungs until he was forced to stop screaming just to take a ragged breath. I looked up at the cloudy sky, feeling the cool morning breeze brush against my face, perfectly insulated from his wrath. "I am not holding your property, Richard," I replied. my voice remarkably steady, cold, and quiet enough to force him to strain to listen. I simply released them from my protection. Good luck with the federal inspectors. I tapped the red button, ending the call instantly. I placed the phone face down on the metal table, picked up my coffee, and calmly went back to reading my newspaper. By noon, the financial markets had violently reacted to the paralyzed fleet. The company's stock value plummeted by nearly 40% in just under 3 hours, facing total corporate annihilation. Richard Vance did exactly what every cornered executive does. He orchestrated an absolute masterpiece of public relations theater. He called an emergency, nationally televised press conference, miraculously transforming himself from an arrogant tyrant into a tragic, embattled victim fighting for the survival of his noble company. Standing behind a polished wooden podium, illuminated by the relentless glare of dozens of camera flashes, Richard looked appropriately solemn. He wore a slightly rumpled dark blue suit, undoubtedly advised by his elite public relations team to appear overworked, exhausted, and deeply concerned for the public good. Ladies and gentlemen of the press, Aegis Corps is currently the victim of a highly sophisticated act of domestic cyber-terrorism, Richard announced, his voice carrying the perfect, practiced pitch of artificial gravity. Early this morning, a disgruntled former employee, an individual who has been exhibiting severe psychological instability over the past several months, launched a malicious, unprovoked attack on our secure logistics infrastructure. How is publicly crucifying my reputation to save his own skin, painting me not as a whistleblower, but as a deranged saboteur. The news networks immediately cut to pre-recorded, tightly edited interviews with my former colleagues, the very same people who had laughed at me the day before. They sat in front of the cameras, wearing expressions of fabricated shock and deep concern. They lied with breathtaking ease, describing me as aggressive, paranoid, and completely unhinged. They spun a flawless narrative of a lonely, bitter woman who had finally snapped under the heavy pressure of corporate life, deliberately destroying vital medical supply chains out of pure, irrational spite. While my face was being splashed across every major television network, alongside the terrifying word, terrorist, I was sitting quietly at a heavy oak table on the third floor of the Seattle Public Library. The vast room smelled of old paper, binding glue, and dust, a deeply comforting, quiet contrast to the toxic smog of corporate lies currently polluting the airwaves. I did not log onto social media to post a frantic defense. I did not hire a lawyer to issue a counter-statement. I did not shed a single tear of frustration. I simply opened my small laptop, connected to a heavily routed, encrypted network, and went to work. I drafted a single email directed to the managing editor of the largest, most prestigious financial newspaper in the United States. There was no desperate plea for justice in the body of the email. There was no personal narrative, no emotional defense of my sanity, and no attempt to explain my actions. The truth does not require a dramatic monologue. It only requires evidence. I attached 3 highly classified, heavily guarded financial ledgers. These documents contained incontrovertible proof of the massive discrepancies in the corporate budget. They detailed exactly how Richard had systematically siphoned tens of millions of dollars from the vital refrigeration and fuel maintenance funds. The ledgers mapped out a brilliant but entirely illegal labyrinth of offshore shell companies, showing how the money flowed directly into his private accounts. He had built his personal fortune by deliberately gambling with the lives of thousands of vulnerable patients, essentially turning a vital medical logistics company into a massive financial fraud scheme. I hit send, closed the laptop with a soft click, and watched the live stream of the press conference on a small corner of my phone screen. Richard was still standing at the podium, leaning into the microphone, thoroughly enjoying his performance as the wounded captain of a sinking ship. We assure the public, our dedicated partners, and our shareholders that we will prosecute this malicious individual to the absolute fullest extent of the federal law, he declared passionately. Then, a very subtle, fascinating shift occurred in the crowded press room. It started as a low, collective hum. Nearly every cell phone belonging to the dozens of reporters seated in the audience began to vibrate simultaneously. The journalists looked down at their glowing screens. The carefully orchestrated silence of the room shattered in an instant. The prestigious financial newspaper had just published an explosive, breaking news article based entirely on my encrypted attachments, pushing the notification to every major news outlet in the country. A seasoned reporter in the front row abruptly stood up. He did not wait for Richard to call on him. The sympathetic deference in the journalist's eyes had vanished, replaced by the sharp, predatory gleam of a hound that had just smelled blood. "Mr. Vance, given your statements about domestic terrorism, how do you explain the recently leaked internal financial documents, proving you personally embezzled over $40 million from the critical safety budgets of those exact same stranded vessels?" the reporter shouted over the sudden, chaotic clamor of the room. Richard froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly sculpted wax figure caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. Another reporter jumped to her feet, aggressively shoving a recording device toward the stage. "Mr. Vance, is it true that you deliberately bypassed federal safety regulations to cover up massive corporate fraud, actively endangering the lives of cancer patients for your own personal profit?" The polished, untouchable veneer of the corporate victim completely shattered. The press conference rapidly devolved into a relentless, unforgiving interrogation. The cameras, once positioned to capture his heroic struggle, were now broadcasting his utter, terrifying realization that the invisible woman he had tried to bury had just buried him alive on national television. Night descended on the city of Seattle, bringing a biting, freezing wind that rattled the glass window panes of my apartment. The streetlights outside cast long, distorted shadows across my small living room floor. I was sitting in the complete dark, watching the muted television screen replay Richard Vance sweating under the aggressive glare of the press cameras. The digital clock on my kitchen counter read 8 o'clock. The corporate world was in absolute chaos, yet my apartment was perfectly, beautifully silent. Then, a heavy, measured knock echoed through the quiet space. It was 3 sharp, deliberate strikes against the solid wood of my front door. I slowly walked across the room. I fully expected to see the flashing red and blue lights of the local police cruisers reflecting against the wet pavement outside. I expected loud, shouting officers from the local precinct, ready to drag me away in heavy iron handcuffs for corporate sabotage and grand larceny. I opened the door to find a single, tall man standing in the dimly lit hallway. He wore a sharply tailored dark suit, a heavy woolen overcoat, and an expression of absolute, terrifying calm. He did not draw a weapon. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket and produced a worn leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming gold shield. "Avery Ward," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded immediate, unquestionable authority. "I am Special Agent Elias Thorne with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Medical Crimes Division. May I come in?" I stepped aside, allowing him to enter my sanctuary. He walked into the small kitchen, his sharp eyes meticulously scanning the space, taking in every single detail of my life. I braced myself for the arrest warrant. I waited for him to read me my constitutional rights. Instead, he simply pulled out a wooden dining chair and sat down at my small table. He reached into his dark leather briefcase and pulled out a remarkably thick, heavily redacted manila folder. He slid it across the smooth wooden surface toward me. "Please sit down, Miss Ward," Agent Thorne instructed, gesturing to the empty chair opposite him. "You are not under arrest. In fact, we need to have a very serious, highly classified conversation about the man you just publicly humiliated on national television." I took a seat, staring cautiously at the bright red classification stamp pressed onto the front of the folder. "Your digital lockout system did a very good job," Thorne began, leaning forward, his dark eyes locking onto mine with intense focus. "The automated data dump your failsafe triggered sent a massive wave of encrypted logs directly to our cyber division this morning. You intended to expose his severe financial embezzlement and his blatant safety violations, but you just exposed something much bigger than corporate corruption." I opened the heavy folder. Inside were dozens of high-resolution satellite photographs, thermal imaging scans, and intercepted cargo manifests. Richard Vance was not just turning off the critical refrigeration units on those 14 ocean freighters to save a few $1 million in diesel fuel, Thorne explained, his tone completely devoid of any emotion. He was deliberately altering the thermal logs because the cargo inside those specific steel containers did not require refrigeration at all. I looked up from the photographs, my mind rapidly racing through the logistical implications. If the cargo is not refrigerated, it is not our authorized biological medicine. Exactly, the federal agent nodded grimly. For the last 18 months, Richard Vance has been utilizing those unauthorized, undocumented shipping routes to smuggle massive quantities of counterfeit pharmaceuticals and highly illegal narcotic precursors directly into the United States market. He has been systematically replacing life-saving cancer treatments with useless chalk pills and using the excess cargo weight to haul illicit substances for international cartels. Aegis Corps is no longer a legitimate health logistics company. It is a highly sophisticated, billion-dollar smuggling syndicate operating strictly under the guise of medical transport. A cold, heavy knot formed deep in my stomach. The sheer scale of the evil was staggering. Richard was not just a greedy, arrogant executive obsessed with profit margins. He was a ruthless monster actively poisoning the entire country. The 14 ships you paralyzed are currently floating dead in international waters, Thorne continued, tapping a thick finger against a printed map of the Pacific Ocean. They are completely locked down by your master code. We know you are the only person on Earth holding the cryptographic key, but we have a severe tactical problem. Jurisdiction, I stated quietly, understanding the legal nightmare immediately. Precisely, he confirmed. If we send federal tactical teams and armed helicopters to board those vessels right now, we risk a massive international incident. Furthermore, the armed cartel mercenaries guarding that cargo will likely scuttle the ships and dump the evidence into the bottom of the ocean long before we can breach the steel hulls. We need those ships to willingly sail into United States territorial waters. We need them to dock peacefully at the port of Seattle, where my heavily armed tactical strike teams are currently waiting in the shadows. Thorne leaned closer across the table, his voice dropping to a dangerous, urgent whisper. I need you to partially reactivate your system. I need you to lift the navigational lockdown and grant the captains just enough engine power to bring those massive ships to our designated ambush coordinates. However, the biometric locks on the cargo containers themselves must remain completely sealed shut. I stared at the glowing lights of the city outside my window, calculating the immense risk. If I input the override command and grant the ship's engine power, the master dashboard at the Aegis Corps headquarters will instantly light up. Richard Vance will receive a priority notification on his phone. The exact second the massive propellers start turning, he will know immediately that someone is overriding the system, which means he will know I am cooperating with federal authorities. He has a private jet fueled and waiting on the tarmac at the local airfield. If he gets that alert, he will destroy the master hard drives, flee the country, and disappear to a nation without an extradition treaty before those ships ever reach the shoreline. Agent Thorne offered a sharp, predator-like smile. That is exactly why you are going to execute the override command while he is completely trapped and utterly unable to run. He pulled a second sheet of paper from the thick folder. It was a digital calendar printout. Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, the Aegis Corps Board of Directors is holding a mandatory emergency video conference, Thorne said. Richard will be live on camera, desperately trying to convince the angry shareholders and major investors that he is completely innocent of the embezzlement charges you leaked to the press. He has to attend, or the board will instantly vote to remove him as chief executive officer. He will be sitting at his desk, staring directly into his webcam, surrounded by dozens of powerful people demanding immediate answers. The strategy clicked into place with absolute, terrifying clarity. You want me to trigger the system override right in the middle of that live meeting. If you lift the lockdown while he is actively defending himself on a recorded video feed with the entire executive board watching, he cannot simply stand up and run out of the room, Thorne explained. He cannot make a frantic phone call to his pilot. He will be pinned down by his own arrogance and his desperate need to maintain his innocent facade. We need you to keep him distracted. paralyzed by his own massive ego, just long enough for my agents to breach the heavy front doors of his office and put federal steel around his wrists. The FBI agent stood up, slowly buttoning his heavy coat. He did not beg. He did not threaten me with prison time for the initial system lockout. He simply looked at me, recognizing the exact same cold, calculated fire that burned in his own eyes. "Will you do it, Miss Ward?" he asked quietly. I looked down at the horrifying photographs of the counterfeit drugs scattered across my dining table. I thought about the thousands of vulnerable patients who had been denied their real medicine. I thought about Richard standing in that pristine glass boardroom, throwing my hard work on the floor, publicly calling me a pathetic nobody, and demanding that I disappear quietly into the shadows. I was not going to do this out of a sense of corporate loyalty. I did not care if Aegis Corps burned to the ground and its stock price dropped to zero. I agreed to this dangerous game for one extremely specific reason. I wanted to ensure that the invisible, nameless woman he tried to crush would be the exact person to hammer the final, heavy iron nail into his coffin. "Agent Thorne," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of fear. "Tell your tactical teams to take their positions at the docks. Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, I will bring the Ghost Fleet home." At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, the sun broke through the heavy Seattle clouds, casting a brilliant, warm golden light across the city. I was sitting at a small table inside a bustling, independent coffee shop miles away from the financial district. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans and fresh cinnamon. I opened my laptop, connected to a secure proxy network, and accessed the private, highly encrypted video conference channel reserved exclusively for the Aegis Corps Board of Directors. I did not log in as an observer. I bypassed the waiting room entirely, using the supreme administrative credentials I had buried in the network architecture years ago. I kept my camera feed hidden for a few moments, silently watching the grid of powerful executives on my screen. Richard Vance was positioned perfectly in the center, sitting at his massive desk in his pristine office. He was sweating profusely, though he desperately tried to hide it by wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He was speaking frantically, spinning a web of legal deflections, aggressively trying to convince the major shareholders that all the federal investigations were the result of my insane, fabricated data on a secondary, hidden monitor that only my system could detect. I watched real-time data packets proving that Richard was simultaneously attempting to authorize massive wire transfers to offshore accounts. He was preparing his golden parachute, planning to liquidate the remaining assets and flee the country before the end of the day. It was time to cut the cord. I pressed the enter key. Instantly, the video feeds of the 50 board members flickered and shrank. My camera feed overrode the central display, expanding to fill the primary screen of every single executive on the call. I sat there calmly, sipping my coffee, framed by the bright, glorious morning sunlight pouring through the cafe window behind me. Talks. Stunned silence gripped the virtual meeting. Richard stared at his monitor, his eyes bulging with absolute fury and disbelief. His polished facade completely disintegrated. "What the hell is this?" Richard roared, violently slamming his fists down on his desk. His voice echoed through the high-quality microphone, clipping the audio with his pure rage. "Cut her feed! Disconnect her immediately! You psychotic criminal! You have absolutely no right to be here!" I leaned closer to the camera, offering him a serene, perfectly calculated smile. "Richard, did you genuinely think I locked the system just to get revenge because you humiliated me?" I asked, my voice cutting through his shouting with quiet, devastating authority. "Did you think I cared about you calling me a nobody? No, I did not lock the network to punish you for a bruised ego. I locked it so the Federal Bureau of Investigation would have exactly 48 hours to coordinate their strike teams and surround all of your black market warehouses down at the port." Richard's jaw dropped. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. He opened his mouth to scream another denial, but the sound never came out. Instead, a piercing, deafening wail of police sirens suddenly erupted through his audio feed. It was not coming from outside his window. It was coming from right outside his office door. On the live video broadcast, in front of the entire terrified board of directors, the heavy, reinforced oak doors of the chief executive officer's suite were violently kicked open. The wood splintered with a massive, echoing crack. A dozen heavily armored federal agents swarmed into the room, their weapons raised. I saw the familiar, towering figure of Special Agent Elias Thorne step into the frame. He did not hesitate. He grabbed Richard by the collar of his expensive suit, slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany desk, and aggressively wrenched his arms behind his back to apply heavy steel handcuffs. "Richard Vance, you are under arrest for international smuggling, massive financial fraud, and the distribution of counterfeit narcotics," Thorne's voice boomed through the microphone, perfectly clear for every major investor to hear. The conference call erupted into absolute chaos. The board members were screaming, clutching their heads in horror as they watched their untouchable leader being dragged away like a common thug. The accomplices sitting in the room with him were quickly thrown to the floor and cuffed. The chairman of the board, an elderly man whose retirement fund was currently evaporating, unmuted his microphone. He was practically weeping. "Avery, please," the chairman begged, his voice shaking with absolute desperation. "He is gone. We had no idea he was doing this. Please, I am begging you. Give us back the administrative control. Relinquish the system override so we can move the legitimate medicine and save whatever is left of this company. Name your price. We will pay you anything." I looked at the grid of panicked faces. These were the same people who had enabled his toxic empire for years through their deliberate, greedy ignorance. "I do not want your money," I replied coldly. "I will unlock the ships and transfer the master credentials to your IT department right now, but I am doing it on one single, non-negotiable condition. By the end of this business day, Aegis Corps will legally transfer the entire intellectual property patent for the thermal logistics system, completely free of charge, to a government-run, nonprofit healthcare organization. You will strip yourselves of your billion-dollar monopoly forever." The executives gasped, but they had absolutely no leverage. They were staring down the barrel of total corporate extinction. "We agree," the chairman whispered, completely defeated. "We agree to the transfer." "Smart choice," I said. "Goodbye." I ended the call, severing the connection permanently. I closed my laptop with a soft, final click. I placed a $5 bill on the table for my coffee, picked up my bag, and walked out the door of the cafe. I stepped onto the sunlit pavement, immediately blending into the rushing river of morning commuters. The men who had arrogantly called me a nobody were now facing decades in a federal penitentiary, their false empire completely burned to the ground. And what about me? I walked down the street, entirely unrecognized by the people passing by. I had returned to being a true, anonymous, invisible person in the crowd, but I walked with a light heart, holding an absolute, undeniable power that no arrogant executive could ever take away from me, the devastating power of the truth. Thank you so much, dear listeners, for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I would love to know where in the world you are listening from today, so please let me know in the comments. As a reminder, YouTube has entirely demonetized our channel, meaning we have zero budget to continue operating here and will no longer be uploading new videos to this platform. If you found today's story powerful and engaging, please help us keep the channel alive by transitioning with us over to Patreon. By joining our Patreon community, you will gain exclusive access to the absolute best, most detailed, and deeply immersive true revenge stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can support our work right now by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description and the pinned comment below. Thank you again for your incredible support, and I will see you in the next story.